My name is Linda Harris. I'm 60 years old, a retired literature professor and a widow. I lost my husband Martin 3 years ago, after 35 years of marriage, and when the grief started to hollow out the walls of our old house, I decided it was time for a change. My son Daniel and his wife Megan offered me a room in their home just outside Denver. It wasn't a big decision. I thought, this is family. You help each other when life gets hard. I sold the house Martin and I built together and gave Daniel most of the equity to help with their down payment. They were just starting out and I wanted to feel useful. I contributed to the mortgage when I could and helped around the house. Megan and Daniel both worked full-time, so I handled the laundry, watched their golden retriever whenever they traveled, and made sure there was always something warm on the stove when they came home late. I didn't mind it really. In fact, I felt lucky. Not everyone has family to fall back on after losing their partner. And after years of grading papers and attending academic panels, the quiet rhythm of this suburban life felt oddly peaceful. Still, there were nights when I missed adult conversation. When I sat in my room, hearing laughter drift in from the living room, I felt a little like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. But I told myself this was normal. Everyone adjusts differently. I had my books, my memories, and a purpose again. I thought I was helping. I thought I mattered. And maybe in those early days I truly did. But looking back, I think I missed the moment when appreciation turned into expectation and kindness became invisible. At first, I didn't see it for what it was. Megan had a way of speaking that sounded pleasant on the surface, but there was always something underneath, something sharp. Like the time she walked past me reading in the sunroof and said, "You really love those old paperbacks, don't you? It's kind of charming, like a vintage shop that refuses to upgrade." I laughed politely, pretending it was a compliment. But that night, when I went to reach for my stack of novels, they were gone. Megan had reorganized the bookshelves to make the room feel more modern. My books were in a plastic bin in the garage labeled MSC. There were other moments. Subtle shifts I told myself were nothing. My favorite teapot disappeared from the kitchen counter, replaced by a minimalist glass one Megan said matched the new backsplash. A photo of Martin and me from our anniversary trip vanished from the mantel one day and never came back. I asked Daniel about it once. He rubbed the back of his neck and said Megan was trying to streamline the decor. She's into that clean aesthetic. You know how she is. And then he changed the subject, like it wasn't worth discussing. That's how it always went. If I voiced anything, I was either brushed off or made to feel like I was overreacting. When Megan decided the dining chairs needed reupholstering, my suggestion about fabric colors was met with a tight smile. "Thanks, Linda, but I think we'll go with something a little fresher, something less grandma." Daniel never stepped in. He always looked uncomfortable, like he was caught between two people he didn't want to disappoint. But somehow, I was always the one expected to yield, to be flexible, to not cause waves in a house that wasn't mine. I kept telling myself it was just an adjustment, that living together took compromise. I reminded myself they were young and figuring things out, that I was lucky to be included at all. But deep down, a quiet sadness had started to take root. It was the kind that doesn't announce itself with shouting or tears. It creeps in during small moments, like being asked to move my knitting from the living room because it made the space look cluttered, or being told the guest towels were only for guests, even though I was the one folding them every week. I began to feel like a shadow in my own family, present but not seen, helpful but not valued. There were smiles and thank yous, but they started to feel rehearsed, like lines in a play I wasn't invited to direct. Still, I stayed quiet. I held on to the idea that my presence had meaning, that my sacrifices were seen, that love surely would recognize loyalty. But I was starting to wonder if I'd confused usefulness with belonging. And deep down, I feared I already knew the answer. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Daniel asked if we could talk. He stood in the hallway, fidgeting with his sleeves the way he did when he was nervous. I was folding his laundry, and for a second I thought maybe he wanted to thank me. But his voice was careful, measured. "Megan and I have been thinking. We're planning ahead for the baby. I paused, a towel half folded in my hands. I already knew where this was going, but I let him speak. He explained that they needed the upstairs room, the one I was staying in. It had the best light, he said. It would make a perfect nursery. And then came the suggestion. We'd love for you to move downstairs. Into the basement. He hesitated. I mean the garden-level apartment. It would give you privacy, your own space. Before I could even respond, Megan appeared behind him. She wore that carefully constructed smile of hers, the one that always made me feel like I was the audience, not a part of the performance. Linda, it's really going to be so cozy down there. I already have a Pinterest board going. Think soft lighting, pale blues, maybe a new armchair, your own entrance. Doesn't that sound perfect? I looked at both of them. My son, who wouldn't meet my eyes. His wife, who was already mentally redecorating the room I still slept in. I swallowed hard and kept my voice steady. That room was supposed to be mine. I helped pay for this house. Daniel nodded quickly. We know, and we're so grateful. But you said you wanted to help us start our future. I stood there in silence. A kind of silence that felt louder than anything I could have said. They didn't see it. They didn't hear it. To them, it was logical, efficient, reasonable. But to me, it was one more way of saying you don't belong here. Not really. They were offering me a corner, a place underground. Nicely worded, yes. Decorated, maybe. But it was still the basement, still beneath them. And the worst part, they thought I should be grateful for it. I nodded once slowly. I said I needed time to think. Megan beamed like she'd won something. Take all the time you need, but we were hoping to start clearing out next weekend. I closed the laundry room door behind me and sat on the edge of the guest bed, hands trembling. They wanted the room. They wanted me out of sight. And I realized with a dull ache in my chest, they'd been working toward this moment for a while. I just hadn't seen it coming. 2 days after the basement conversation, I got a phone call that changed everything. I almost let it go to voicemail. The number was unfamiliar, a New York area code, and I didn't feel like talking to anyone, but something told me to pick up. The voice on the other end was professional, warm, and direct. She introduced herself as the director of acquisitions at a firm called Brighted Global. We've been following your work for years, she said. Your adult learning frameworks, the curriculum adaptation models, and the multilingual assessments. We'd like to buy them. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. I asked her to repeat herself. She did, slowly, clearly. $60 million. For full rights, global distribution, and an ongoing consulting role if I were interested. The number sat in the air like something unreal. I couldn't speak. She asked if I needed time. I said yes, of course. And then I hung up and just stared at the wall. Later that evening, I opened my laptop and pulled up my accounts. Retirement funds I hadn't touched. Royalties from textbooks that were still in print across 6 countries. A modest investment portfolio that Martin and I had built slowly over decades. All of it had grown while I lived as if I were scraping by. The total, even before the offer, was just over $23 million. Add in the 60 Brighted was offering, and I was looking at more than $80 million. I leaned back in my chair, the screen casting a soft glow across my face. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I thought about Megan calling my books clutter. Daniel asked me to give up my room without a second thought. About the way they assumed I had nothing to offer except the leftovers of my savings. And I realized they didn't know me. Not really. I had let them believe the version of me that made them comfortable, the one who folded laundry and stayed quiet, the one who was easy to ignore. But that version had never been the full story. Now I had a choice. Not just about where I lived, but about who I was willing to be, again. And I knew without a doubt my silence was almost over. I didn't say a word after the call. Not to Daniel, not to Megan. I sat with the truth like it was a secret flame warming my hands in private, while they assumed I was cold and broke. Each day passed the same. Megan would make her little comments, some about how retirement must feel like floating without direction, others about how lucky I was to have a roof over my head. I'd nod, smile softly, and clear the plates from the table. Silence became my armor. The quieter I stayed, the more they revealed. Daniel had started avoiding dinner altogether. Megan claimed he was working late, but I knew better. He didn't want to sit across from me and see the tired lines in my face or the way I clutched my teacup a little tighter than usual. Maybe it made him feel guilty. Maybe it made him feel nothing at all. One afternoon, I overheard Megan on the phone. She was in the kitchen door ajar. She was talking to her sister, laughing. She said I was becoming dead weight. Those exact words, dead weight. Like I was some worn-out piece of furniture she couldn't wait to move into storage. That phrase clung to me for days. I repeated it to myself, while folding laundry, while watering the plants she never touched, while sweeping the hallway she walked through with heels clicking like punctuation. Dead weight. Like I hadn't taught for 30 years. Like I hadn't paid off their mortgage. Like I hadn't buried the only man I'd ever loved and still gotten out of bed every day since. The final straw came one evening after dinner. Megan sat across from me, swirling wine in her glass. She looked at me without smiling and said she'd been researching assisted living options, just casually, as if it were a favor. She said I might enjoy the sense of community, activities. People my own age, they have bingo nights. She said it like I was already gone. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I just watched her holding her gaze longer than she expected. Then I got up, cleared her plate, and left the room without a word. In that moment, something inside me clicked into place. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pride. It was clarity. They saw me as a burden, a placeholder, someone to manage. And the saddest part wasn't that they were wrong. It was that I'd allowed it. I'd let them shrink me to fit inside their assumptions, and I'd stayed small out of love. But love, when it forgets to respect, turns cruel in quiet ways. That night, I sat on my bed with a legal pad and started making lists. Not dreams or regrets, just facts. Assets, lawyers, flight options. I wasn't going to fight for a place in a house that had stopped being home. I was going to leave, on my terms. And they wouldn't see it coming. The morning after Megan mentioned the assisted living brochure, I made my first call. I waited until the house was quiet. Daniel at work, Megan at yoga. I dialed my lawyer's number from an old card I kept tucked in a book Martin once gave me. His name was Curtis, sharp as ever, and I could tell by the silence on the other end that he hadn't expected to hear from me again. I laid out what I needed. Transfer of funds, discrete asset movement, purchase inquiry for a property on the coast. No trail that would raise questions. He asked if I was sure. I said I'd never been more. That same afternoon, I called a real estate agent in Carmel, California. A woman named Judith with a calm voice and strong instincts. I told her what I was looking for. Something quiet. Ocean nearby. A study with light and space for books. She sent me 5 listings by sundown. I picked the third one before I even finished scrolling. It was a modern cliffside home with glass walls, 3 bedrooms, and a library facing the sea. I could see myself there. I could breathe in that picture. I told her to begin the process immediately. Full cash offer, no contingencies. Back at the house, I kept my face still. I made dinner. I folded sheets. I laughed at Megan's stories about her clients. When Daniel got home late, I asked how work was and listened with the same old patience. It was all an act now, but not out of spite. Out of strategy. I boxed up the few things I cared about, letters, photo albums, and a ceramic bowl Martin brought back from Kyoto. I shipped them to a storage unit under a different name. Every step was small, careful. I didn't want them to notice a single shift in the current. At night, I reread my contracts, checked escrow updates, and reviewed travel arrangements. It was a strange kind of peace, this quiet planning. For once, I was doing something for me. Not to please, not to help, not to earn a place at someone else's table. but to reclaim my own. Megan mentioned a guest dinner party coming up and asked if I could stay in my room that night, so the house looked more open. I smiled and nodded. It didn't bother me anymore. Soon this wouldn't be my problem to navigate. Daniel told me the baby was coming in 6 weeks. He looked proud, hopeful. I congratulated him, meaning it. I had no desire to carry bitterness with me, but I also had no plans to stay long enough to hold that baby. 1 week before my departure, I bought a one-way ticket first class, quietly canceled the utilities in my name, finalized the wire transfer. All the while I cooked, I listened, I nodded in all the right places. They never saw it. They never imagined I could be the one quietly walking away. And that was the most beautiful part of it. I didn't owe them noise, just distance, just freedom. And it was already on its way. It happened on a Tuesday evening. I had just come back from a walk when I found them both waiting in the living room. Megan's arms were crossed, her face flushed. Daniel stood behind her looking like a child caught between anger and confusion. Megan held a sheet of paper printed from my email. I recognized it instantly. The closing contract for the Carmel property. I had left my laptop open. Careless, maybe. Or maybe part of me was ready. She demanded an explanation, asked what kind of scam I was pulling. Daniel looked stunned, kept asking if it was real. 60 million, Mom. Where did that even come from? I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and carried a folder to the table. Slowly, carefully, I laid out the papers one by one. Financial statements, tax returns, royalty contracts, the offer letter from Brighted signed and sealed. I didn't say a word until the last page was down. Then I looked at them. Both of them. I said, "You wanted transparency. Here it is. You thought I had nothing left. You were wrong." Megan sat down like someone had been hit. Daniel kept shaking his head, trying to make the math work in his mind. He asked why I never told them. Why did I let them believe I was just what I asked, just old, just a guest, just a burden? His mouth opened, then closed again. Megan recovered first. She asked why I hadn't invested in the nursery. Why didn't I offer to help raise the child in comfort? I smiled, not cruelly, but with something heavier. I already gave. I gave everything I thought I had. Time, money, patience, respect. They didn't know what to say, so I kept going. You asked me to leave my room. You joked about assisted living. You spoke over me, around me like I was furniture with opinions. I reached into the folder and pulled out my final statement. The one that mattered. I'm not the burden. I was your blessing. And you lost me. Silence followed, thick and heavy. Daniel finally whispered that he didn't mean for things to turn out this way. I nodded. Maybe he didn't. But he didn't stop them either. Megan stood asked where I was going. I told her the name of the street in Carmel. She asked if I was cutting them off. I said I was choosing peace, and I couldn't find it here. There were no more questions after that, just a quiet understanding that something had ended. I gathered my folder, turned toward the stairs, and for the first time since I moved into that house, I felt taller than the walls around me. I wake up to the sound of waves now. The morning light spills into my bedroom soft and golden, and I don't need to rush anywhere. My home in Carmel feels like a breath I had been holding for years, finally let go. The community here is small but sharp. Writers, retired professors, artists who speak with their hands and laugh with their eyes. I joined a local women's collective focused on literacy programs for girls in underserved communities. Every Tuesday, we host workshops in town, and I watch young women discover the same fire I once had in my 20s. A few months after I moved in, Stanford reached out. They wanted to honor my work in adult education and asked if I would consider a guest lecture series. I accepted without hesitation. Walking back into a lecture hall on my own terms felt like returning to myself. There's no bitterness here, no anger left to hold. Just clarity. The version of me that lived in Daniel's house was a fraction, and even then, I dulled my edges to fit. Now I live at full volume. I choose where I sit, what I teach, and how I spend my days. Sometimes I think about what they said. Dead weight. A burden. But those words don't stick anymore. They drift past me like sea mist, harmless and far away. What matters is this. I didn't just leave. I reclaimed my time, my voice, my worth. Freedom, I've learned, isn't about escape. It's about return, and I've finally come home.